Okay. So for the axial skeleton, this is the first part of the skeleton lecture. You should know the components of the axial skeleton. One of the best ways to identify each of the features is to use the lab guide. So the lab guide here is you will have the bones as well as the features. So the bones and features, and then the best way to see the features is to actually go through the rest of this PowerPoint and the images, and it'll actually go through and tell you about the features, or you can find them. There's a jillion sites online or images in your book to show you where each of these, but this is the list of features that you would be responsible for to identify visually or descriptively. So if I could describe, I don't know, something descriptively like the foramen magnum, giant hole at the base of the skull, is called what? Foramen magnum of the occipital bone, or, you know, the sphenoid bone where it contains the optic foramen. So you would either need to identify them descriptively or visually. So we'll move down here, sorry. This next part of the face, again, the lab guide is the way to go as far as the specific facial features and the bones that you would be asked to identify. The visual components, the best way for them, really, though, for the online folks, is going to be the worksheet. So this here is sort of a handout that's kind of nice to make flashcards and stuff from, but you can also use the worksheet images that are actually the skeleton images. So let me get out of this. I'll go further down to the rest of the skeletal system. Oh, like I said, here's the worksheet images I was looking for. So these here are also a really good way because you can color them, especially if you do many images. So you can color them and go through all the features and processes. And I think one of the videos, I already go through that. Then we'll move forward. So that's for the axial skeleton. As far as the vertebral column goes, you should know the components of the vertebral column. So you should know the types of vertebrae that are in there. What are the features on the vertebrae that are common to all the vertebrae? That would be like the spinous process in the body and the transverse processes and things like that. So what are characteristics that are specific to a single vertebrae? That might be not specific to a single group. So cervical would have transverse foramen. The thoracic, you know, has its connection with the ribs, as well as the lumbar vertebrae, what's unique about it. So each one of those areas, although they have features that are common to all of them, cervical, thoracic, and lumbar have their own specific features. And then you should know about the vertebrae that are fused together, that form the sacrum and the coccyx, as well as the characteristics of the sacrum, which really is characteristics that define it from male versus female. So that would be for the vertebral column. So we'll scroll on down here to the thorax. So for the thorax, you should know the number of ribs and the different types of ribs that there are and what number they are associated with. Then you should know the sternum. You should be able to identify the manubrium and the body and the xiphoid process of the sternum. Okay, and that's it for the axial skeleton. So for the appendicular skeleton, you should know the components of it, which are the pectoral girdle, the pelvic girdle, those are the two that we covered first, and then the limbs. You obviously have the upper limb and the lower limb. So for these, a pectoral girdle, you should know what the bones are in the pectoral girdle, clavicle and scapula, and then you should know all the features that those bones have, as well as what they articulate with. That means what that bone, what's another bone that it's going to butt up against. So that defines an articulation. Then as we go, we'll just do the upper limb here. So we have features of the humerus. The upper limb includes the humerus, which is your arm, your radius and ulna, which constitutes your forearm. The carpal bones are your wrist, metacarpals are your hands, and the phalanges are your fingers. So you should know on each of them what bone they articulate, the features of those bones, and be able to identify them visually, you can use the worksheet here for that visual identification, as well as, like, this is just the example for the pectoral girdle though, or the lab guide will also have the list as well, just like we did for the axial skeleton. So then the next part, is the pelvic girdle. So you know that the pelvic girdle, parts of it, two parts of it are the ossa coxa, those are the hip bones, if you will. But you have to know that they're made of three bones, the ischium, ilium, and the pubis. And then you should know that when they hook up or are bound to the sacrum, it forms the whole pelvis. And you should know the differences between the male and female pelvis. Of any of the features that you will be asked to identify, you should always indicate if it's right or left, and I should have said that in the previous ones, all the time, anytime, you always have to indicate if it's right or left, and that would be not your right or left, but right or left of the skeleton and the patient, so to speak, itself. So then anytime you say a feature, if you're doing like where your hands are up on your hips, that would be the iliac crest of the, say, right ilium, or whichever one I would be pointing to if it's an image. And so you have to always make sure you say the name of the feature of the bone and then right or left. If it's two of those kind of bones, if there's two iliums, then you have to say right or left on the ilium side. If it's a single bone and two features, then you have to put right or left in front of the feature name. So let's see, you can see, let me grab an APR picture. So here's a picture from the APR that you could use to identify the features. But the more detailed list or specific list for each bone is listed here. And obviously we can see the bone as the main header with the main bullet point, and then the secondary bullet point are the features that you're responsible for that bone. And then finally the lower limb, which is your thigh of the femur, as well as your lower leg, the tibia and fibula. The tarsal bones are your ankle bones. Know what they articulate with, so those bones, what they're communicating with, as well as metatarsal, those are the other toes of the foot. The ankle goes from the tarsal bones go from, including the heel, kind of the back half of the arch of your foot, where the metatarsals are the front half of the arch of your foot until you get to the phalanges, which is your toes of the feet. So you should know them. You should know what bone connects which other bone, as well as their features, be able to name them right and left, identify them on a diagram, and use proper terminology. Then we'll get into, let me stop share here, and then we'll get into the joints. Just right here. So as far as the joints go, you need to know how joints are classified. So joints are classified in three ways. There are three classifications of joints. A joint, by definition, is two bones that meet. Now we have two bones we have more than two bones, obviously, but in our skull, if the two bones meet in the skull, that's still considered a joint. Now we don't want our skull flapping around and moving, and so it's a type of joint that elicits no movement. That would be one classification. So then we have another classification that offers slight movements, a little give. We'll find those between our radius and ulna and our tibia and fibula, or our symphysis pubis, where there's some movement but not a lot of movement. That's another type. And then we finally get to the classification of joints that are freely movable, that most people think is the only definition for joints, but that's the synovial joint. So I want you to be aware that there are three distinct classifications of joints. A synarthritic joint is one that has no movement. It's like the sutures in the skull. The amphiarthritic joint is one that there is some slight movement and slight give. We see those in the pelvis as well as in the limbs. And then finally, the freely movable synovial joints are these diarthroses joints. So synovial joints and diarthroses are the same type of joint. So in part 2, we'll dive down and go more specifically into the synovial joints. You should know the components of those synovial joints. Let me see, where's the guide here? So you should know the features, that means the components. So it's made of a synovial cavity, a membrane, synovial fluid. It has articular cartilage. You should know what type of cartilage that's made of. There are fibrocartilage discs in some joints. There are fat pads and bursa in some joints. There are tendons, which is just connecting muscle to bone, that help stabilize these joints, but mostly the tendons are what's causing movement. Wherever the tendon, the muscle, is attaching onto a bone, that bone usually is the moving bone. So any of your joints are going to have, the synovial joints are going to have a movement, and so you should know the terms of movement. So like abduction, adduction, and it's these terms of movement that you're going to need to know when you do your muscle action. So when we get to the next chapter of muscles, then we're going to talk about, anytime you mention a muscle, say, we'll talk about biceps brachii, you're going to need to use these terms of movements that are part of the joint chapter. So biceps brachii would be flex, you can say it 2 ways, flexion at the elbow. In the case of the biceps brachii, it'd have to be in the supinated position, but that would be flexion at the elbow because it's telling you specifically which joint is moving. Or you can say what part of the body is moving. That means flexion of the forearm, because the forearm, if it's the biceps brachii, is what's coming up and moving. Where it's originating at, that's stationary, so you're not naming that portion. So there's 2 ways, but you need to use the terms of movement. That would be like flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, things like that. So those will be part of the muscle components. And then of the synovial joints, you should know the knee in particular. So let me see, we'll go down here to this next one on the specific joints. The knee is by far the most important one that you need to know. All of the features of the knee, the ligaments that make up the knee specifically, but as well as other features and bones that constitute the knee joint. There'll be questions about the rotator cuff muscles, as well as some questions in general about the shoulder or hip joint, but you don't need to know the specific components or the details of those joints as much as you do the knee. The knee, you need to know most of the features. Okay, then we'll go over to the muscular system. Ooh. To share it first with you. I'm clicked over onto it, but I haven't shared it with you. Okay, here we go with the muscular system. So as far as the muscular system goes, I have a few questions on terminology, but the bulk of the issues with the muscular system are really naming the muscles. If there's, on the list of muscles, do I have a list here? No, I didn't. Yeah, I do have a list. So my lab guide is probably the most efficient way to go through the list of muscles. If you want to see them, again, there's great websites, better than I'm doing here, that you can see where they're located and identify them. The pictures that you need to know for the muscles that's utilized on the exam will come directly from the APR, or Anatomy Physiology Revealed images that are part of the worksheets. But if you want more of a list structure as far as what muscles to name, that you might want to make flashcards, the lab guides are going to be what's useful for that. So we can see here the muscles of facial expression. And on these lab guides, some questions have asked me a question of, if it's a muscle lab guide, why on earth would I have a skeleton or bony structure indicated? And I have that there because I figured you can draw in the muscles in the proper location. So not all of them might be able to be drawn in the skeleton images that I give you, but that's the reason why there's a skeleton. It's meant for you to identify yourself the origin and insertion. Even though you're not being asked to know those for the exam, it helps you know how to draw them onto the muscle. It helps reinforce the skeletal system features, and then by going from and drawing from the origin to the insertion point, it makes a lot more sense what the action of that muscle would be and how it's pulling across the joint. So you should know, you should be able to identify each muscle in a diagram, and for each muscle you should be able to know its action or its movement. And its movement or action, if you're going to write it out, would include using the terms presented to you in the joints chapter. And that would be, so if we were going to say deltoid muscle, don't say lift your arm up. We would have to say abduction of the arm, so that at least you're using the proper terminology. And identifying the movement, or you can say abduction at the shoulder. So again, you can either name it by the part of the limb that's moving or the joint that is being pivoted. So that is it for the muscles. So you've got the axial muscles, I guess muscles of the face. We have muscles, there's going to be muscles of the neck. There'll be, let me see where our list here is. So facial expression, you should know muscles of mastication, that means chewing or eating. Muscles of the neck, what muscles we need to breathe, those would be the intercostals as well as the diaphragm. We've got trunk muscles, and again, for each of the muscles, you need to say what they do. So we have several different abdominal muscles, and then in contrast to the muscles of the abdominal muscles in the front, I'm trying to put at least one of the muscles of the vertebral column on the back, and that one's just only single one, erector spinae. There are a lot more muscles there that we have in the body, so I've pared down the total body muscle list for you considerably. I tried to focus on mostly muscles that the big gross movement muscles, as well as muscles that you would palpate, or most people should know what they do, whether it's from a gym or not. So as you look at diagrams, you'll see that not everything on a diagram I'm going to have you know. So if you're following other diagrams from other textbooks or other sources to help you better visualize these muscles, just make sure you go through our list. Probably the lab guide list would be the best one to go through, and then you can then circle or identify somehow only the muscles you need to know. And that way you're not studying extra muscles that you don't need to know. And so this is pretty much it for the review, unless you want to go through specific questions. You just really need to know the skeleton, bones, features. You should know joints, the 3 classifications, and then specifically what makes a synovial joint, as well as of the synovial joints, the knee joint being the most important one. And then for muscles, name it, point to it, or identify it on a diagram, and know its action. So, I mean, as far as there's a lot to do, I don't mean to make this a short thing and minimize it, but there's not much to explain about it. It's not like some of our other chapters where we have to kind of go into a lot of physiology. So it kind of makes the studying part of this easier. Questions from anybody?
I have a question.
Okay, Julie?
When on our muscles cheat sheet, it has just the hamstrings. Now, are you going to go into detail wanting to know the hamstring muscles?
Thank you for pointing that. Yes, you definitely need to know the specific muscles that make up the hamstrings, as well as the quadriceps femoris group. So there's 3 muscles that make up the hamstrings and 4 for the quadriceps, and you should be able to name them. Thank you for bringing that up.